Welcome to the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Leo.
I'm Joel.
You can email us at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com. Our Patreon page is live now, patreon.com/deepdivebookclub.
For anyone just tuning in, this podcast is centered on having a long format discussion about books that we have read or books that we're in the process of reading. We dive into both fiction and nonfiction. The one thing better than having a good book is having a great discussion about it, and we would like to include you in this conversation. Leo, I refuse.
Almost read that verbatim. You did. You almost did it. That's good.
I
That's the best I've seen you do it.
To read something verbatimly.
That's okay. That's okay.
So, to pull everything together, last week we opened up the Book of Five Rings, or the Book of Five Spheres.
Scrolls. Could be scrolls. Most
by
likely
Musashi.
Scrolls back then.
We discussed both the author himself as well as Earth and Water, the books of Earth and Water. Deep dove into those, deep into the water. And today we'll be concluding Musashi's book, talking about Fire, Wind, Void, and then, of course, closing out everything with critiques, thoughts, and takeaways. And with that, let's get started into the Scroll of Fire.
So the Book of Fire opens with Musashi discussing using the environment and surroundings to your advantage. And again, remember from our last episode that Musashi here is specifically speaking in a swordsmanship and martial arts context, both applied directly into a one-on-one combat situation, but he also says this can be extrapolated to larger scale combat, unit on unit, army versus army. This section is mostly technical, again, not a lot of philosophical or symbolism that could be taken away from this section. So one of the things he says is to always put the sun behind you, or at least to your right. He also says keep your enemy to your left. And one of the translators specifically says the reasoning behind this is to obscure seeing the long sword, because the shorter sword would be closer to the enemy. Is that correct, Joel?
Yes, so in Japan, the saying goes is that there's no left-handed swordsman in Japan. And that's not a true statement, but the statement is typically said in kendo schools or other schools that look at using the sword, because the way traditional art was transferred was teaching to a group or teaching to the masses. So you have people learning right-handed swordsmanship, even if they were left-handed, because it was a group setting. And you all do the same katas, or you do the same movements. Now, having the sun behind you is pretty useful because you're obscuring the person's vision or the opponent's vision. I could see that being useful, archer unit versus archer unit, for example. But also, it does obscure the longsword because, again, no left-handed swordsman, so assuming that your right hand is the dominant for using the katana, you are then obscuring that length. And I don't recall specifically where in the book it is. We'll probably get to it, but he discusses pointing the sword at the opponent's eyes to also obscure the length of the sword.
Right. I don't remember if I put that in here specifically because the whole scroll is highly technical. It's a list of a lot of techniques, but I do remember that. Point it directly at the eyes, and also stab at the eyes. I believe that occurs in this scroll as in the previous scroll.
In this scroll specifically, he does get into a more technical, nuanced structure of movement, footwork, and cutting down the opponent, as opposed to the Earth book, which had a pretty good base of philosophy as well as analogies that he utilized. Here, though, he does talk a little bit more directly about swordsmanship and sword work.
So far, we have the advice for putting the sun behind your back, or at least to your right, and then to also keep your enemy to your left. The only other advice he gives specifically for using the environment and surroundings to your advantage is to push the enemy into obstacles or into situations where they would have bad footing.
Or using the environment to your advantage.
The rest of the scroll is a continuation of describing various techniques and tactics. Most are physical tactics, as mentioned earlier, but Musashi consistently reinforces the neutral intensity. Most of these tactics are physical, as mentioned earlier, but Musashi consistently reinforces the mental intensity and concentration needed behind all of these techniques, behind these various tactics, which is probably the biggest takeaway for me, is to see the mental intensity that underlies this, the kind of psychology that Musashi brings to bear. Because although I've done a small smattering of sword-based martial arts years ago, I will not be doing a lot of sword work in my future that I'm aware of. Unless we enter into a kind of Dune post-apocalyptic scenario where there's not going to be projectile weapons and we need more hand-to-hand combat, I don't see myself using a sword very much in the future. Although swordsmanship and sword-based martial arts are fascinating, and the small bit of time that I did sword work in martial arts was a lot of fun.
Using the sword in martial arts can be seen in several different avenues. Of course, you have the historical context of understanding how swords were used, and you can get as nerdy as you want into understanding both the metallurgy, the use of the swords, and how they were connected to the human body, or the meaning of them to a socioeconomic group, which was the warrior class. But in terms of modern day martial arts, my personal interpretation from my understanding and teachings are that the sword itself is used to enhance the structure of martial arts. So learning how to fight with a sword is not necessarily preparing you to fight with a sword on the street. It is rather teaching your body movement, because for some people, their brain translates footwork better with a weapon in hand, and then you take that weapon away so that they can still do unarmed appropriately.
And that was specifically the case when we spent some time training Aikido style Boken sword katas, when the teaching was primarily Tai Chi based and combat based, hand to hand. He specifically incorporated Aikido style Boken work for that, to understand the movements better and get the footwork better and get the fundamentals of the Tai Chi techniques he wanted us to use.
Right. And in some ways, a unarmed throw technique is almost the exact same footwork as certain sword katas or movements. So here, Musashi is talking about the use of the sword, and as he said before, if you can see the way narrowly, you can see the way broadly, and in his way of applying it, he's using the sword itself. The other thing inside of this scroll is its fire or he, and that has its own connotations, both culturally, but as well as in martial arts. As opposed to earth or water, fire is very explosive, it's rapid, and it talks about intensity. Whereas water sometimes is looked at as a tsunami of building up energy and then crashing against the enemy or the enemy's shield. Fire itself is typically viewed as a very rapid burst of intensity, so striking down your opponent quickly and ferociously, rather than the other version of death by 1,000 cuts where you're slowly breaking down your enemy.
So we won't go through an exhaustive list of all these techniques, but we will highlight a few and discuss them. First one that I want to discuss was what is titled as holding down the pillow in the Cleary translation. Quote, "Holding down the pillow means that when you have attained my science in reality and are engaged with an opponent, whenever the opponent evinces any sign of intending to make a move, you perceive it before he acts. Stopping an opponent's attack at the initial outset, not letting him follow through, is the sense of holding down the pillow." End quote. And this is a good opportunity to bring in two translations here to see the different ways that these get interpreted and how much more clear one of these are. You can tell one of these translators likely has martial arts training, the other does not. Joel, would you like to read the Bennett translation?
Yeah, let's read the Bennett translation here. So from Bennett, quote, "Musashi uses the term makura, which means pillow or headrest, and is usually translated as such, i.e., holding down the pillow. Makura is also used to indicate the introduction or lead-in to a story or piece of music. In the context of this teaching, Makura is referring to introduction or the very beginning of the opponent's technique, end quote.
Completely different translation, along with an inclusion there of some historical and cultural context that you would not know if you were not an expert.
There are so many homonyms that we miss from Japanese translations because they have such a interwoven language where you would know that even a pronounced different word has the same root writing structure, and so that in itself is almost like a connective piece that we would never get.
Right, and that's a discussion that we'll have fairly in depth when we get to the Scroll of the Void as far as specific word choices and a little bit into the etymology that we can tell. Not entomology, etymology. I spoke with an entomologist the other day and learned a lot of fascinating things about bugs. We're talking about etymology here.
Etymology. So the next technique that Musashi talks about is, quote, becoming your enemy, end quote, or becoming the opponent. From the Cleary translation, quote, becoming the opponent means you should put yourself in an opponent's place and think from the opponent's point of view, end quote.
And then for comparison, let's read the Bennett translation. Defeat comes ahead of the engagement through believing one's foe is a skilled adherent of the way who exemplifies the principles of strategy, end quote.
What do you think about that?
Again, this just highlights for me the benefit of having multiple translations on hand here, because the two combined give me a good sense of what Musashi means here and what we can interpret. Becoming the opponent in such a way that you put yourself in his place and think from the opponent's point of view makes a lot of sense. It's applying theory of mind to someone who is your partner, either in combat, negotiation, whatever situation. Even if it's a low stakes interaction, there's still a form of negotiation that is benefited from thinking about what the other person is thinking or perceiving, specifically from the place of their own perception and perspective, that both mentally and physically. What are you seeing right now as you're sitting in the spot you are sitting, and how is that informing your opinion? What's the light doing for you? What is the positioning of your body doing for you? But then also mentally, if I say, hey, I think we should change this part of this project we're working on, that's my opinion, but then I can do further in-depth communication on multiple layers with you if I am thinking about how you are going to perceive that and how you think about that exact same thing. So there's not things lost in the articulation. So this is one that I think is helpful to think about and is a good framework to think about now. It's something we can apply now. It's both an actual martial arts technique and way of thinking, but also something we can have a discussion about now. And then the Bennett one, defeat comes ahead of the engagement through believing one's foe is a skilled adherent of the way. That's interesting that Bennett translates it that way. For me, that's to actively think against the idea that someone is, as the kids would say, someone's an NPC. Think of them as having their own in-depth thoughts and their own very lived experience. So you don't, in this context, it would be underestimate them. Put another way, it's to make sure you're seeing someone as a fully 3D or 4D being, not a 2D entity.
Usually, for training martial arts, you constantly want to consider your opponent as being better or stronger or whatever, so that you come in more prepared, you come in more vigilant for your movements and activities. And the same thing for negotiating, right? Even in business deals, you shouldn't come in thinking that you're better than the other person. You should consider their position and where they're coming from, but also that they're just as intelligent or as capable. And that will make you treat that person in such a way that they will in turn reflect to you perhaps a better connection or a better settlement in your negotiations.
And that's a good point as far as when going into a situation, think of them as more skilled or more intelligent or more capable or more advanced in whatever capital W, way that the context applies to. Combine that with the previous one of try to see something from their perspective so that your estimation and understanding of that person updates along the way.
All right, the next technique that Musashi talks about is about infection. And in this, he talks about be relaxed in mind and body, infect the enemy with relaxation, and take sudden, violent advantage.
Bennett's rendering of this is, quote, loosen your body and spirit as your opponent inadvertently follows suit. Seize the initiative to attack powerfully and quickly. There is a similar tactic called making the enemy drunk. You contaminate his mind by exhibiting listlessness, hesitancy, or weakness, end quote.
It's a very powerful and useful technique, and one I can see as being very effective. If you relax the whole atmosphere and you can shade the violent intentions in your mind prior to the attack, you can relax the opponent or relax the situation to take advantage.
One aspect that gets brought up in these scrolls that we are not highlighting that much, just to keep this from being even more episodes long, is rhythm and tempo, and this speaks to that a little bit. You can purposefully influence the tempo of an interaction, the rhythm of an interaction, slow down your speech, calm down your body language, calm down the whole situation, just lower the temperature a little bit, specifically to bring things to a speed and pace that you can handle. This, in an adversarial standpoint, is to control that tempo and say, hey, this is the context and setting that we're going to operate in, and then quickly reverse that and speed up to disrupt and surprise attack.
And in this case, Musashi, in the rhythm section, which we don't necessarily need to get into, which for one is technical, and for two is, difficult to explain person to person, but even extraordinarily difficult to try to explain over a audio medium.
Right.
But Kendo and other sword schools talk about this rhythm, and it's pretty codified, where you have Sin no Sen, which is one rhythm where you're attacking the attack or you're taking the initiative with the opponent's initiative. The other one is Go no Sen, which is reacting afterwards. And then the advanced level, which is Sin no Sen, which is anticipating the decision of the opponent and then having the rhythm based on an empty mind after that, taking the initiative. And in this case, Musashi is advocating use of those rhythms before. In this case, Sin no Sen is anticipating the movements, infecting the opponent's decisions, and then taking a decision.
And one of the ways that we can maybe apply this to our modern situation that's not specifically combat or adversarial. It can be applied in an adversarial situation to lower the temperature of negotiations or arguments. But for the everyday argument with a roommate, someone you live with, a family member, you can be mindful of the tempo at which the conversation has taken place. You can be mindful of controlling that tempo, controlling the volume or how quickly you're jumping from subject to subject and the heat at which the conversation is taking place. Lower it down, slow it down. Something you can purposefully affect.
The opposite of slowing it down or lowering the temperature, Musashi also talks about shouting in this scroll. He discusses the various roles of shouting, both for the individual and a large scale. And I think plenty of people that have seen videos or whatever, you hear the kia or the yelling that's used in some martial arts, which can be effective and useful. A random scream sometimes jolts people out of the current situation or allows for you to have a skipped beat of initiative.
That reminds me of the idea. I don't remember. I was listening to some interview, I think of a hypnotist who said that one thing that he's used before in tense situations, there was a situation where he was going to get mugged, and very calmly he said something completely out of context, off the wall, absurd thing in a very calm way that caused the person who he was about to have a bad or violent altercation with to stop and change his whole frame of mind for a second. The confusion and the chaos shifted it from anger, point A to point B, thinking to, wait a minute, what's going on? That allowed him to step in and change the flow of the interaction to prevent a situation, a disruption.
Disrupting the script.
Yeah, disrupting the script. One of the interesting applications of shouting that is discussed in the scroll is, quote, "Do not cry out loudly as you strike with your sword. If you emit a cry during the attack, it should be low in tone and match your cadence," end quote.
And part of the yelling exercises that's used historically is also to continue the breathing. So if you force yourself to yell or you keep that cadence with your yell, you are exerting your body along with your breath so that you can continue to breathe. Because all of us have probably experienced you do something very strenuous, you hold your breath in order to have like a couple of seconds of extra strength as you brace your body, which can be good for those few moments, but you have to continue breathing in order to continue fighting or continue doing whatever strenuous activity. So these are also techniques in order to keep yourself breathing.
Okay. Anything else that you would like to discuss on the Book of Fire, the Scroll of Fire?
No, I think that's a pretty good summary of the Book of Fire.
Only other thing that I forgot to mention, we were talking about becoming the opponent, becoming the enemy. One thing that our discussion made me think about was in barbell training, for example. If you are doing a warm-up set or a sub-maximal set, for me, for an advanced enough trainer or for an advanced enough trainee, I sometimes find it helpful to have them practice, okay, this is a warm-up and it's not the heaviest thing you've lifted, but I want you to do this warm-up lift as if pretend it was the heaviest thing you were lifting. And that does a few subtle things for them, one of which is taking it as seriously as if it were the most difficult thing. Very similar to the mindset we were talking about in our discussion. That is something that could also be an application for that tactic.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, that wraps up our discussion of the Book of Fire. We will take a brief break, be right back with you, and we will discuss the Book of Wind.
And we're back, and we're going to continue our discussion with Musashi's wonderful writings as we transverse from the Scroll of Fire to the Scroll of Wind, which, let me tell you, I'll go ahead and say that up top, probably my least favorite scroll, only because it was more of a critique of everyone else than actually being technically savvy.
It's still a lot of fun to read, though, especially if you get the tone across of what Musashi was talking about.
Oh, sure. He was dissing a whole bunch of Mick dojos and everything like that. Mm-hmm. But still, it doesn't hold as much, timeless wisdom.
No, not quite. So, in the overview, we mentioned that the Book of Wind is a collection of critiques against the other schools or styles. It's a fun read and it's humorous, though Musashi was likely deadly serious about it. I don't know that he had a sense of humor, how we might have thought about it, but we'll never know. A fun little bit of etymology here. The word for wind being used is also the word used for style. And at least one translator mentions that this is an intentional double meaning or pun. The psychology behind the technical talk is fascinating, even if you are not a martial artist or into martial arts. So let's go through this list of critiques. There's fun discussions to be had. This is not going to be exhaustive, as with all of our discussions of these scrolls, because we're not here to read the book. We're here to just discuss some points in it. So first critique that he has is against schools employing extra long swords. Not extra swords, but swords that are extra long. Musashi says that the only advantage of having an extra long sword is increased reach, and that basing a school around this is a too superficial understanding of the principles of strategy. Makes sense. You have any thoughts about that one?
No, I think his critique here is probably dissing people using an artificial advantage rather than just being more technically capable or more skilled, which I suppose is interesting because it is also a juxtaposition of his using of advantages via sunlight or hiding the blade or subterfuge. So it's interesting that he mocks this advantage. It is too based, but his advantages, which are subterfuge, are not.
Good point. Good point. Next critique that he lists out here is aimed at schools that use swords with force. Another way of translating that would be schools that use powerful blows. And here he says that using too much force is irrational and counterproductive. Properly cutting with a sword must be neither too weak nor too forceful. The equivalent error of relying on brute force in large-scale combat is over-reliance on numbers. Bennett specifically says here, quote, "The underlying principles of my school is to defeat the enemy in any situation by applying strategic wisdom without incorporating anything that is excessive." And just a note here on translation, the term Musashi uses here is muri. This can also mean irrational or unreasonable. Completely tracks with Musashi's style and the mindset that he would advocate for, to use a modern concept that did not exist in his time. Mindset. Joel, what are your thoughts on schools that use powerful blows?
That definitely makes sense in a Japanese context, especially with folded metal that is not very useful. So excessive blows typically will damage the metal parts of your weapon and potentially breaking them. Several sword schools, one of the techniques that are learned in a historical context is metal on metal, using the binding or breaking of the sword. So instead of striking the opponent, you bait the opponent to then hit the back of the sword, which is the most likely place for the sword to break. And in this, for the theater of the mind, for the listeners, imagine you have two swordsmen facing against each other.
Using single-edged swords.
Yes, single-edged katana swords. Your opponent strikes down and misses. You step out of the way and then take your sword, instead of striking the opponent, striking the back of his blade in order to break that blade.
Cutting edge, or you're also
you're using your cutting edge to break the back of their blade.
Understood. In D&D, we refer to attacking a weapon as sundering attacks.
Right. Which sunder also typically refers to armor, right? Breaking armor, destroying the metal components, or the, how do you say, the, not constitution.
Integrity.
Yeah, the integrity of the weapon. The advantage there is if you're attacking the weapon is the closest target to you, because if you're going to strike the opponent, that means you are probably near the range of their weapon to touch you, but your weapon can touch their weapon without the weapon being able to touch your body, increasing that distance. And then if your opponent has a broken sword, you can much more easily win that.
Now who has the extra long sword?
Right. So the powerful blows typically opens up advantages for the opponent when the initial strike fails, in the same way of overcommitting your army to a position, that becoming perhaps a Pyrrhic victory. You then can lose the war due to that.
Interesting digression, side note for the listener. Joel and I enjoy playing racquetball, and the racquetball is not as popular as it was decades ago, but it is what we were taught as kids, and it's a off and on hobby we've enjoyed here and there. And our discussion here is making me think of that. In racquetball, you can use a ton of force over and over and over again. Not always a great idea, because you can be very gentle and very technical and use softer, more accurate serves and returns, where excessive blows and powerful blows maybe have their place, but don't need to be used constantly.
Both are useful, and you need to know when to use force, or in this case, bring it back to Musashi, violence. in explosive violence versus when you use other tactics. In his case, showing up late to a duel in order to irritate his opponent. For racquetball, I will kind of digress just slightly. I really enjoyed playing racquetball yesterday. I got to burn almost 2,000 calories. It's a great time.
Yeah, a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Understanding the way of the sword, it's almost like understanding the way of the racket.
Nowhere else can listeners get a comparison between swordsmanship and the quaint sport of racquetball.
You know, I think if I was playing against someone that had an extra long racket, I would say, you're just using unnecessary advantage. You don't understand the base of the racket. You don't understand the skill of the sport.
I mean, that's fair because oftentimes I will choke up on the racket near the top of the handle, not exactly proper technique, but then I can more finely move my wrist to manipulate the direction things are going and blunt the force with which I'm returning.
So the opposite of using an extra long sword or racket is using short swords. And Musashi has a lot of opinions and feelings on short swords. His father was very adept at using a jute, which is a two-pronged weapon that is relatively short. You can go look it up. We already talked about this.
Right. Just a reminder, very similar to a sai. Think of the stereotypical sai with the long middle point and two smaller curved points near the handle. Now remove one of those smaller prongs, and that's something similar to the images you'll see of a jute online. Go ahead. From a translator here who says that tachi were classified as swords over 36 inches or 90 centimeters in length, and katana were 24 to 36 inches in centimeters, that's 60 to 90. As such, the katana was designed as the short sword. His critique of schools that use short swords have to create tactics and strategies that are too reactive to enemy actions due to the need to deflect, parry, block, and close the distance to grab. This makes you unnecessarily biased towards defensiveness.
Yeah, yep. Mm-hmm.
Quote, at the core of strategy is to subjugate the enemy and precipitously push them back. If you are accustomed to blocking, evading, disengaging, or deflecting attacks in the course of your training, it will become ingrained and you will be inadvertently influenced by the enemy's ploys, end quote.
Don't defend too much. You got to attack.
Specifically, schools that use short swords or only short swords, he's saying, are setting themselves up in their context to be too reactive to what the other person is doing. Don't know how to translate this outside of swordsmanship.
I suppose if we want to divulge into perhaps the psychology of an individual, if you teach a child or you teach yourself to constantly be reactive or constantly be defensive and not be on the initiative, then you are training yourself to only be reactive to situations rather than taking the initiative to change it. The easiest thing I can think of is like in a friend group, if you never take the initiative to instigate a gathering or connection and you only just wait for invitations to do things, that could make you too reactive to social situations rather than saying, hey, I can actually stand up and modify the current surrounding, right? Having that charisma or that initiative built into a person to do something.
Right. That's something you don't even need to rely on charisma for. Just take initiative.
And I've seen that in the workplace culture where I'll have people that worked with me or under me, and you can easily tell people that are good at learning how to take initiative. So instead of waiting to be told what to do, they can anticipate the next steps or the next needs and can start instigating that on their own. And that is an extremely valuable trait inside of a person.
Agreed. Any more thoughts on the critique of schools that employ short swords?
No.
So let's talk about schools with many techniques. His essential critique here is that too much variety and complexity appear to make a school look profound, but it is in truth shallow, confused, and a poor strategy.
I agree.
Stick with the basics.
I think this can be translated pretty easily to most of our world. It's okay to be a jack of all trades, but really you should learn how to master one thing first.
My takeaway here is stick to what you know really, really, really well, and then intelligently branch out from there. So if a discussion comes up of a topic that I'm not well versed in, that's something that I want to resist the urge to jump in on. For example, I'm not going to debate you on the finer points of a piece of chemistry text that I read. I am going to ask you, since that is your expertise, to help me understand, vice versa.
Yeah, I think people should create a mastery within themselves first and stop trying to learn too many quote unquote techniques out in the world. Just get really good at one thing first, right? Know the way narrowly. Bruce Lee, I think, has a great tie-in famous quote, right? I don't fear the man that practices 1,000 kicks one time, but the man that practices one kick 1,000 times. So I think that is I don't want to say the word fundamental or universal truth, but that's what I believe in.
Yeah, that's just your takeaway from it.
It's like my opinion, man.
That's all we have is your opinion. Schools that emphasize sword stances. So let's read the Bennett translation here because it seems to make the most sense. Quote, in the way of combat strategy, it is mandatory to unsettle the enemy's stance. A little further on, I am thus adverse to stances if it means relinquishing the initiative. That is why I teach the ukomuko, or stance of no stance, in my school. End quote. My understanding here of this critique is that don't get too fixated on the form or the right proper form to do something if it gets in the way of what we were just talking about, taking the initiative.
In taijutsu, we'll talk about hinka. Hinka just kind of means variation. And you first need to learn the form in order to break the form. And when we have newer students, we talk about, don't worry about it. Just learn this structure first. Because a lot of new people are like, oh, yeah, but this is assuming our opponent is punching with their right hand. What if they punch with their left? It's like, don't worry about that. Learn the basic structure. Get the muscular knowledge in there. And then we will practice hinka, or variations. How do you translate that to the situation? And this is something I believe Musashi was keying into back in the 1600s, which is don't get fixated on the stances or structures. You need to learn how to have no structure, which will come up in the Book of Void. But you have to first learn structure, and then you break the structure, is a more long form of what my martial arts training philosophy is.
Right. Okay, next critique about fixing the gaze in other schools. Another way of translating fixing the gaze is focus of the eyes. Quote, setting your gaze on specific points will cause uncertainty and will adversely affect your strategy. End quote. Don't hyper-focus on one thing, but do some focusing. That's my understanding of what he's saying here. The only thing this makes me think of, since we played racquetball yesterday, was one thing that I find helpful is when I am both focusing on discretely one point that I want to serve to or return to, but also spending a lot of calories trying to look into my peripheral vision as much as possible and keep awareness of everything around me.
I think that's great. I think that's enough of a translation.
That's about all that makes me think of right now. Again, these are technical critiques of schools that aren't his.
Yeah, when I've trained with other schools, especially in sword work or in other work, they talk about looking at different things. And so some philosophy is you never focus on anything. You kind of keep your eyes blank so that you can observe everything in the area. Other schools talk about staring near the opponent's eyes, but not their eyes, to both understand where their weapons are and also to anger them. Like you're almost looking in their eyes, but you're not quite looking their eyes.
I've read that not in the context of martial arts, but in maybe more superficial or shallow negotiation tactics, gimmicky, stare at the bridge of someone's nose between their eyes, don't look directly into their eyes. And I'm not really sure what that's supposed to do, but something along those lines, kind of a faux intimidation technique for some reason. An overly adversarial and
Yeah,
too specific.
unnecessary. And
Unnecessary. Yeah.
there's plenty of negotiation books or talks about like how often do you look at someone's eyes. You can't stare constantly, but you also can't not look at all. So you have to like make eye contact, then look away. It's just, to me, perhaps overcomplicating a simple human interaction.
I think that goes back to Musashi's stance of no stance. Don't get confused with the little stuff. Yeah.
Except cavers. My caver friends, I can definitely tell when cavers are talking to each other because they don't look at each other in the eyes. They just stand next to each other, looking in the same direction and talk. Because we're used to, you don't talk to each other with your headlight on, right? Because then you're blinding the other person.
Headlight awareness. Right. Footwork in other schools. His thoughts on other schools' footwork are that many forms of footwork emphasized by other schools are too telegraphing and too susceptible to exploitation. They are also disadvantageous in certain environments. That's my interpretation of what is said here. Here's Bennett's specific translation, quote, "In our school, nothing about the feet changes. It is no different from routinely walking down a road in accordance with the enemy's cadence. When hurrying, do so with an unhurried bearing without moving too little or too much, ensuring that your steps do not become inconsistent." End quote.
Be sure of your footwork and treat it like walking.
I've heard similar things. Next critique, the use of speed in other schools. Quote, "Those who are highly accomplished may seem slow, but they never lose their timing. Whatever the case, a skilled practitioner never appears to be rushed." End quote. When I see someone really, really good at a physical technique or anything, whether it's a skilled racquetball player or a skilled carpenter or someone who's really skilled with crochet or anything like that, they don't seem hurried. It flows naturally. That's what this one makes me think of.
Sure. When I was an EMT, I would notice that the much older EMTs, even in call out, they would be slower. They wouldn't run up the stairs. They wouldn't run into the house. They would walk into the house. Yes, there's a need to be quick, but they were not in a hurried pace where they were moving faster than their thoughts. They were allowing themselves to absorb the information around them to make medical decisions. And the newer EMTs were the ones that would grab the bag and then run in.
Good context for this one. Okay, before we jump into this last critique that he has that gets a little bit more broad, and we're going to kind of go in depth on a translator's note, is there any other thoughts you have about the Book of Wind or any of these selections we've made of his critiques? Again, all kind of straightforward. So let's talk about the last critique that appears in the Book of the Wind. And we're going to start by figuring out what to do with the title here. So in the Cleary translation, he titles this critique as "The Esoteric and Exoteric in Other Schools." Okay, so what does that mean? Bennett changes the title to "About Interior and Exterior Teachings in Other Schools." So, quote, "The term Musashi uses for exterior is omote, and interior is oku. Omote techniques are the representative surface or gateway techniques, and the first ones a novice will learn in a martial arts school. Contrasted to this are the ura or oka, interior teachings. These are essentially the secret-most teachings of a school and are only taught to advanced students. Musashi always employs these terms in Nitin Ichiryu, but unlike his contemporaries, he attaches no particular arcane meaning to them. His mantra was simply to learn the fundamentals thoroughly without concern for any esoteric nonsense. By painstakingly researching the basics for years in the cauldron of combat, eventually the swordsman would arrive at a profound understanding of his way as long as he kept to the true path. Over-philosophizing of this ideal was a detour from the true path of swordsmanship, and that is what Musashi is indicating here." End quote.
So kind of breaking this down a little bit, you have omote and ora or oku. I often hear ora. And those are the two ways of looking at exterior interior. And they're the basis for many different forms of martial arts. Oftentimes, ora is looked at as interior or folding the opponent in on themselves. And in traditional Japanese, imora gyaku is twisting the joints in order to make the opponent. And for our listeners, if you picture a person just standing straight up in an anatomical position and the person folds forward, pending at their hips, that is ora, or movements that make the person go interior.
So what you're saying is interesting because what Bennett is talking about here is more so interior and exterior in a different way.
Yeah, I'm building there.
Okay, take us there.
And emote is the exterior, which again, if you just picture an anatomical person, the techniques such as emote gyaku is a lock to make the person bend backwards so that their back is arched. Great. Now that we have these two physical descriptions or hopefully physical pictures of both emote and ora, we can look at Musashi's teachings, which in this case is Niten Ichi Ryu. Ryu just means school, Ichi meaning one, and this altogether kind of translates as two heavens and one school, which more or less is just Musashi's teachings. Tie all that together, my understanding of what Musashi is kind of advocating here with the Book of Wind is don't listen to all these other schools. My school is great, but my school focuses on utilizing both the exterior and interior motivation, or exterior and interior philosophy, to reach his school, which is the Niten Ichi Ryu. They have, and kind of I'll just summarize what I'm trying to say here, which is they both have a physical and philosophical meaning behind that. And I believe Bennett is also translating that note for us. So not only is the exterior, interior, or emote and ora both physically using your body and the opponent's body, but also your understanding of your internal and external self, internal environment and controls, and external advantages and subterfuge.
Right. That makes sense. My understanding here is there's like a mystique around martial arts and long-standing traditions, especially in more traditional settings, where there's almost like a magical component to the innermost secrets, or now you've reached such and such degree of innermost secrets. There's secret techniques, and it creates a mystery. It creates a mysticism around it, to use a dangerously vague term. What Bennett seems to be, and this could be an extrapolation rather than a translation, Bennett seems to be talking about here that Musashi purposefully is at odds against a type of mysticism and is focusing more on a Zen style of intensely focus on the techniques and the basics of what I teach you. Through repetition and practice, you will gain, a deeper, more enlightened way of understanding the school and understanding the deeper meanings through the basics. Don't get caught up in the mysticism. That's what I saw in this particular last critique that is translated various ways.
Great. What a great closing to the Book of Wind. Anything else?
I don't think so. Fun little scroll, quick. Just from a history standpoint, it's just fascinating to read this. I love it. So let's take one more quick break, and then we will jump into the last book of the Book of Five Rings.
All right, and we're back. Going to conclude the last scroll for this and then get into our closing statements. And that's going to be the Book of Emptiness, or the Book of No Thing, or Void, or Nothing. Tell us more about this, Leo.
So, first thing, let's talk about the name, because this is thematic for the entire scroll or book of nothingness or emptiness. There is no agreement on what it means. There's no agreement on interpretations, what Musashi thought here, how philosophical or literal any of this was going. And that holds true for the name itself. So there are several renderings. We're just going to refer to it variously as Book of Emptiness. The Bennett, for example, he calls it the Ether Scroll. Japanese name here is Kunomaki. Kaufman calls it the Book of No Thing. And for those of you listening, the word no and thing are hyphenated. So not nothing, but no hyphen thing, which I think is a pretty good way of rendering the concept here. That's one of the things I like about the Kaufman translation is what he does specifically with this section. And then the Victor Harris translation calls it the Book of the Void. So we've got ether, emptiness, void, and no thing. Widely varying interpretations here. So first, let's talk about the key word here. So remember the Japanese here, according to Bennett, is kunomaki. Let's talk about the word ku. This is the same character used in Buddhist texts for a concept called emptiness, which we'll break into. If you were to look up the Japanese dictionary definition of what this word means here, ku, the ideograph here, it can be rendered as sky or heaven, empty/vacant, void, hollow, nothingness, absence, free/open, and also unreal/illusory. Similar to kind of how we would render some of these concepts, both literal and figurative. Okay, so now let's talk about back to that Buddhist concept of emptiness. Mahayana Buddhism, this same word or ideograph is how the Sanskrit concept of sunyata is rendered, emptiness. You want to talk to us a little bit about sunyata, Joel?
Sunyata, or emptiness, coming from Mahayana Buddhism, Mahayana being the newer version of Buddhism as opposed to Theravada Buddhism. There's also a difficult understanding of what truly emptiness or nothingness means for the Buddhist ideology as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that nothing exists. It doesn't mean a no thing at all. It is kind of a lack of all things, permanent essence. Reality is interdependent. Forms are empty of fixed selves, of fixed nature. Emptiness is the condition for change and action. There's a lot culminated into it, and this is one of the things where you would read a whole bunch of scrolls or text, and you would have a deep understanding of just this concept, and then this concept is a representation, a token, to mean everything else behind it.
Yeah. Impermanence, I think, is a good way, from what you just said, that helps me begin to understand this concept, because there's a lot between me and truly understanding this concept. But impermanence and no fixed form, another way of looking at it. So the philosophical implications here of what Musashi might be meaning, because remember, he is influenced by Zen Buddhism. He's likely thinking about the non-duality. That's a concept we see throughout the previous schools of just the one we were just looking at. Have a stance of no stance. Don't overly look at things in a dualistic way. Freedom from attachment. Don't get hung up in the little things. Don't get hung up in the footwork or what you're doing with the eyes. Clarity of perception, bring to bear an intensity of spirit rendered in a more modern concept, an intensity of focus or mindset, and action without ego fixation. From the Bennett translation, one of the concepts that applies here, I think, is recognize that the true ether is where all the clouds of confusion have completely lifted, leaving no hint of haziness. Again, back to that clarity of perception.
In the physical form of what ku is, when we talk about schools and movements, we discussed previously hinka, or variations that are found in the katas or movements. Ku represents the initiation of hinka, or the initiation of having no form. So there is a kata for ku. However, that is up to interpretation for movement. The other part of it, if I were to express it to you, other schools all have like a kata or a starting set of movements for you to understand the school. For Ku, I will try to walk through this briefly and succinctly. And again, this is from a taijutsu perspective. The first kata in that school is receive the attack. Usually you're blocking a kick or a punch, however you wish. And then you are taking your hand, opening it up to the heavens, to the sky, for the person to look at, or throwing blinding powder, so to speak. You are creating this void, this trap for this person to fall into. And once you have their attention up, you then deliver a thrust with your foot, sword, or hand into the opponent. So it's very much you're creating a cloud or void or emptiness for your opponent to fall into. And from that cloud, you strike.
Fascinating. I like that. Describe what Joel was just doing there with his hands. He was flinging one hand up, like opening his palm. I like the taijutsu tie-ins here. Okay, go ahead. Next, I was thinking we could look at just 2 excerpts from the Kaufman translation to get a sense for Kaufman interpreted here, because these are interpretations and extrapolations. These are not necessarily direct translations from what I can tell, comparing all the various translations. Let's go through just the entire Victor Harris translation, because it's the whole book only takes up half a page, depending on the book.
It is extraordinarily short.
Very short.
You could have read it 10 times with the amount of time it'll take us to walk through it verbally.
Absolutely. Okay, the first Kaufman excerpt that I wanted us to look at here is, quote, "When you have truly understood the universe in relation to your art and your art in relation to the universe, you will come to understand no thingness. This may appear to be a very difficult concept to understand, but it is quite simple. Do not take anything for granted and do not put emphasis on the things of men. In this way, understand my strategy," end quote. What do you think here, Joel?
I mean, what does anyone think that researches this text and tries to understand it? It's a difficult concept to understand. Sure. It's quite simple. Sure. You just do the thing. Almost like a Buddhist ideology of you're just constantly in meditation. You don't think about meditating. You don't think about nothing. You just allow the beginner's mind, the open mind, to exist. But if you think about that open mind being there, you've lost that train of meditative thought.
That reminds me of the idea of sudden enlightenment. Right. You know, the only thing keeping you from being enlightened in some schools of thought is that you're not ready for it. Like, you can be enlightened whenever you want. You just got to let it happen.
Yeah, spontaneous enlightenment, a very interesting concept in theological development in the school of Buddhism.
Very, very interesting.
Because who can tell you that you're enlightened or not?
Right. And then one rendering I heard was that, well, sometimes the master knows that you're the only thing in between you and the enlightenment. So he's going to give you all these really hard tasks and these puzzles and these koans that you have to struggle through. So you feel like you're struggling. So you feel like you earn it. And then, oh yeah, look, I achieved enlightenment. Whereas the master knew all along that you were the thing that was the obstacle, nothing else.
Huh? Enlightenment. Yeah. It's we won't go too far down that path because that would be a
fascinating subject, though. Maybe we'll read something, a Buddhist scroll or a Buddhist text.
We could read a Buddhist scroll and then
this would be a great place for listeners to weigh in on what they want to hear more or less of.
We would love for you to weigh in your opinion as well.
Okay, next excerpt from Kaufman here, and then we'll jump into the whole text. Quote, "The Zen point of view suggests that you stop all conceptual thinking. Stop thinking about what you feel is right or wrong. Quite frankly, because all the universe is simply no-thingness, or mu. There is no reason to pursue any attempt at perfection. Perfection is all there is, and when you come to realize this, you will have understood my way of strategy and the way of the warrior, at which time you can forget about it and just be it," end quote. Great example of an absolute interpretation and not a translation. Is this nothing like this exists in any of the other translations?
It's the author attempting to be beautiful rather than fidelitous here is my interpretation.
On top of which he is adding in what he thinks needs to be understood. What he thinks Musashi is implying here. We went over this a little bit in the beginning, but my only hesitation with the Kaufman translation, I appreciate it for what it is. My only hesitation is that he doesn't delineate between what is a translation of Musashi and what is him adding in stuff to expand on what Musashi has written. It's almost like writing something that doesn't have references or quotations if you are pulling from other sources.
Sure. In his defense, though, the attempt to translate it sometimes is not being fidelitous, to give the interpretation, to be like, hey, based on my understanding of the culture and the language of English at this time, here is what Musashi meant by completely removing everything he said and translating it into modern day lingo.
Right. Beautiful, fascinating subject that I love hearing translators talk about. I listened to an interview recently of people that did another translation of a Dostoevsky novel, and just the thought that went into everything about that. Fascinating stuff. Love it. Okay, so those are the two Kaufman excerpts that add a little supplemental information. I think that helps us get an idea of the different renderings here. And because the Book of Emptiness is so short, I figured we could just read the Victor Harris version of it. Again, it takes up a page, and then we'll go from there. Sound good?
Go for it.
Okay, quote, the Nito Ichi way of strategy is recorded in this, the Book of the Void. What is called the spirit of the void is where there is nothing. It is not included in man's knowledge. Of course, the void is nothingness. By knowing things that exist, you can know that which does not exist. That is the void. People in this world look at things mistakenly and think that what they do not understand must be the void. That is not the true void. It is bewilderment. In the way of strategy also, those who study as warriors think that whatever they cannot understand in their craft is the void. This is not the true void. To attain the way of strategy as a warrior, you must study fully other martial arts and not deviate even a little from the way of the warrior. With your spirit settled, accumulate practice day by day and hour by hour. Polish the twofold spirit, heart and mind, and sharpen the twofold gaze, perception and sight. When your spirit is not in the least clouded, when the clouds of bewilderment clear away, there is the true void. Until you realize the true way, whether in Buddhism or in common sense, you may think that things are correct and in order. However, if we look at things objectively, from the viewpoint of laws of the world, we see various doctrines departing from the true way. Know well this spirit, and with forthrightness as the foundation, and the true spirit as the way. Enact strategy broadly, correctly, and openly. Then you will come to think of things in a wide sense. Taking the void as the way, you will see the way as void. In the void is virtue and no evil. Wisdom has existence. Principle has existence. The way has existence. Spirit is nothingness. End quote. And that last line Cleary renders as, quote, in emptiness there is good but no evil. Wisdom exists. Logic exists. The way exists. Mind is empty. End quote.
There's the whole book.
There's the whole book.
I'm glad you all have leveled up your Buddhist ideologies and have gained spontaneous enlightenment by learning the true ways, the mind being empty, and to just do.
So we weren't kidding. A very, very short little book there. So what do you think, Joel? What does this mean for you? What are your takeaways here from the Book of Void?
My takeaway here is not any different from my takeaway from Buddhist sutras that I've read, which is in many ways just existing, just living, just accepting the changes and the constant impermanence, is in itself the way, the movement. There is no perfection that you can obtain, but you have to strive towards it. You have to continue with an open mind, a beginner's mind, to seek out wisdom, to seek out the way, and thusly you will continue being a true warrior and having a true spirit by perpetually being in this impermanence and accepting change for what it is. What do you think?
I like that interpretation. I like your takeaway there. My takeaway, I went through this a few times. I'm like, okay, what can I get out of this? What's my takeaway here of what Musashi is saying? My first takeaway is that I like this Zen-inspired version of emptiness or formlessness, of having an unattached awareness from which correct action naturally arises. For me, that makes me think of the kind of equanimity that could be found from knowing something very deeply, and then you can apply that more broadly. Whether it's specifically something like physical training or mental training or understanding something, the kind of calm, no effort way of extrapolating on that can arise. More specific, concrete example being, getting the basics down in barbell training, or getting the basics of a language down when you're learning a new language. There's different ways of having a way of no effort through, got to make it through the other side. I like that version of awareness. My other takeaway here is Musashi specifically seems to be talking about, poignantly here, but throughout the book, of mastery, but mastery beyond technique, because he lists out specific techniques that he goes over in very fine detail, but he also talks about things broadly, and there seems to be an overarching emphasis on mastery that ties in well with that open awareness, that kind of no effort that helps me understand his mindset and how he thought, or how I can begin to understand how he thought. And the last takeaway I had from it is the absence of fixed concepts allowing perfect responsiveness. That makes sense. If you don't get overly rigid in how something has to be or how a situation is, you don't have preconceptions going into a situation. Only other thing I would note here on our discussion of the book Avoid is looking at the various translations. The graphic novel translation that is based off of the Wilson translation has Musashi explaining the thoughts of the Book of Emptiness as he is carving a wooden statue. And I really liked this creative, literal way of showing what it means to perceive that which exists and doesn't exist in a way that Musashi might have meant. Seeing a block of wood, not getting fixated on its current form or any particular form, and carving it out to become something. I really like that rendition of it.
To pull in Musashi's teachings with other teachings throughout classical martial arts, the initial kata that students typically learn first, which is earth, the form kata, and I'll explain this visually. You take your hand, and as you're beginning the movement, you connect your pinky and thumb together while having your other three fingers tied together in a slight cupped fashion. And as you move into the enemy, you are pulling this up to strike upward into the throat of the enemy. So almost like bowling, you're taking and using the pendulum bowling ball to move forward. There are mechanical aspects to this, but what I want to talk about right now is the more philosophical aspect, which is your 5 fingers connecting everything together. Chi, Sui, He, Fu, and finally Ku. So your thumb and your pinky come together to create a circle. So as earth and void come together, that is where you create something. You start with earth, you go through all of the scrolls or the schools, and when you get to void and you complete void, it circles back to earth itself. That's a very classical understanding of doing martial arts is as you go through all the schools and all the trainings, you return back to the very beginning, the very basics. And that combination in itself creates your school, your art, your strategy, your way, which is returning to the fundamentals. But also through Void, you have form arise and you have form disappear or dissipate. There you go. So there's the philosophical, physical tie-in that you would have in oral traditions before even reading. Because back then, not many people could read or write either the high intellectual Chinese characters or the common Japanese character.
Okay. Well, there it is. The Book of the Void. Hopefully not too much of a void in your mind. Let's talk about bad reviews.
All right. So we've concluded our discussion about the book. We will now do our now traditional closing of the book, which is going to be talking about bad reviews, because those are fun sometimes, quotes, takeaways, and we'll close everything out. So, Leo, the first bad review, and again, great bad reviews, and by great, I mean they're fun to read. They're just titillating to me, that I get from Goodreads. The first one, if I were to kind of summarize what a whole bunch of people said, is the author says, study this well, which really means they know nothing and pass it on as sagely knowledge. And to give you an example of kind of what I'm summarizing here, quote, for a classic guide to strategy, this was pretty poor. It could be the translation, but when every mini paragraph says, one should study this well, and writing is too limited for me to explain by, you have to wonder about the depth of knowledge that the person can actually impart to you, end quote. And then kind of collecting that again, another one, quote, way too much, quote, this is too complex to describe, end quote, or this must be transferred orally. Why write it then? I get maybe it's so the student asks the master about it to learn it properly, end quote.
Yeah, when I was looking through comments and reviews, this is a theme that I saw as well. Interesting. And I think what's happening here for some people is not digging into the historical concept enough to kind of begin to understand this in its time and place. Another thought here is that, well, we didn't actually bring this up, but then some of the translations, that phrase, study this well, or other such renderings of you must study this deeply, or you have to do a bunch of practice. You have to do a bunch of other stuff to actually get what I'm saying here. We didn't highlight this in our discussion, but that is in there a lot. That never really stood out to me or bothered me. For me, it was more of a reinforcement of the fact that as something very heavily based on martial arts and very heavily based on a lifelong learning process, that's just kind of a way of saying, hey, this is a crystallization of something that requires a lot of physical and mental work to even begin to understand what I'm saying here. Doesn't bother me in the least. It didn't feel like it left anything out. It is humorous, just on the page, out of context with everything else, to write a bunch of stuff and then say, hey, you need to think about this a lot to actually get what I'm saying here, or you need to go practice this to actually understand what you just read. It's humorous to read out of context, and I can understand how some people might be frustrated by that, but I didn't do that.
Of course, I disagree with this particular critique of the book, and to defend the book in a couple of different manners. One, I agree with you in that Musashi is re-emphasizing that this is a lifelong journey of studying. You can't just read this book and be done. You can't just know the way and study the techniques from this book. And also, if you try to translate a movement, a simple movement, even say, describe how to go pick up a pencil, sit down and write something on a paper.
Even what you were just explaining, the two physical movements that you explained in our discussion today, we did it audibly with commentary, and still, that's not a real substitute for seeing it in person and having someone walk you through it.
Right. And that was a subset of a hand movement to a whole kata.
Right.
It'd be impossible to translate to words on a scroll. The other thing about that is I will say this book in particular is not a book that you can just pick up, read, and be done with it. In order to read this book, it almost feels like you have to understand the historical context, read about Musashi's life, read different translations.
Dig into translators' notes about as simple as the pushing down on the pillow concept, that there's a poetic interpretation beyond that. For me, this is exactly what you're getting at, is that you get out of it what you put into it. And it's not like reading Harry Potter, no offense, Harry Potter, where what you need is all there on the page.
Right. And this is a book that requires you to do homework if you want to understand it. So if
you wanted to, yeah.
Yeah. So I wouldn't suggest this if you want just a light read to go to bed to, which I do love. I do that myself. I read a book before I go to bed. This is not the book for that. This book is going to require homework. This book requires you to have some understanding of either Japanese culture, history, Buddhist history, martial arts experience. You got to bring something to the table here.
Right. We're sitting here talking about this book, but so much of our conversation, there's so many things we've brought into the conversation, etymology, cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, how people thought then, discussion of what weapons were used at that time, how they were used in a cultural context, a little bit of the politics at the time, the tradition of using Chinese in elite text literature at the time. There's so much that we've discussed around this book to begin to give it a context, and I don't even feel that we did an adequate job of doing that. So there's so much additional information. This also makes me think of something I was reading. The idea that when you read a book, when that book is written, you read the book when the book was published, you can never recapture that moment. Let's say we read a book 10 years after it was published, 20, 30, 50 years after it was published. Reading that book decades after it was originally published, it would be very difficult, if not impossible in some respects, to capture and understand and experience what it was like for a reader who read it when it was originally published. Because this pairs perfectly with the Book of the Void that we just went over. There is an impermanence. There is a formlessness. We think that things stay the same or don't change that much, but there's so much changing that we can't go back upriver to the moment in time when the book first came out. And a reader was as close as possible temporally to the cultural and historical moment they were in to experience that book. Think of something simple like the novella The Stranger by Albert Camus. We're in America and we're decades after this came out, but there's very little we could do to experience what it was like to read that when it first came out, because it is temporally far away, it's geographically far away, it is culturally distant, and there is moments in history that have happened between now and then, that there's a dialogue between now and then that we can't suspend. There's a level of, we can't suspend that knowledge of reality because it's too ingrained into the context of where we are in the current moment. So there's a real sense of reading anything. This was a fascinating concept I was reading about. There's a real sense of reading anything that you just can't recapture what it was like. And now take that and apply it to the extreme case here of the Book of Five Rings. There's so many obstacles and distances between us and when it was originally written. Fascinating concept.
Okay. The second subset of critiques that I had as I was reading through this was the principles are so obvious that they shouldn't have been written. Quote, I was honestly expecting more. It was rather basic, and so I found myself thinking most of the time, no poop, Sherlock, end quote. I inserted poop there for it. The second one that I'll give you as evidence, quote, the only reason these principles are timeless is because they are so self-evident that no rational human could disagree, but that doesn't make them useful. Case in point, if I say, when facing an enemy, the objective should always be to defeat them. Even though it is true, it shouldn't be considered a timeless principle because who goes into a fight with the objective of losing, end quote.
I think this just follows the exact same thinking of the previous. It's that You just don't understand the point of this book.
They also don't understand that this book was almost 400 years ago. The concepts that we might consider common knowledge now is not common knowledge back then. We also have books that are written for the first time, or ideas that are written down for the first time, that are timeless because of their contextual basis. Like you're saying, their space and time in history. For example, if I say, oh man, I had a static electric shock the other day when I touched the doorknob, you know what I mean.
That's not groundbreaking.
That's not groundbreaking. But for you to even understand what a static electric shock is, the idea of electricity or electric required so many hundreds of years of a culminated knowledge basis to define that. So if I were to read you the Wikipedia page or read you an old publication for what static electricity is, it'd be perhaps dull or boring and quote unquote, how could you think that's timeless? But we have so much built into us now from years and years of knowledge.
And what you're saying is a good point. The other thing that this makes me think of is we just don't know how groundbreaking any of what Musashi wrote is. We have some clues where there's some evidence of how innovative or groundbreaking it was at the time, but it doesn't. The simplicity of some of the stuff he's saying could be because it was 400 years ago, and maybe some of what he's saying was new at the time. But even if it wasn't new at the time, even if we entertain the idea that that wasn't groundbreaking at all, simplicity does not in any way take away from profundity, in my opinion. A lot of times it's the opposite. And that's one thing that I appreciate is the directness and simplicity and straightforward nature of what Musashi wrote here. And there is a confusion we have, and I don't know how modern this is. There's a confusion we have that complexity equals intelligence or greatness, or for something to be profound, it needs to be complex and layered and make my brain hurt. The work is on the reader in this instance, I would think, for these simple, straightforward statements to, quote, make your brain hurt, if that's what you want. I can get endlessly into any of the little nuances of this book just because I'm wired to be fascinated by some of those things. But I can understand how someone could not connect with the simplicity of the language, especially if they were going into it thinking they were going to get profound wisdom. Profundity takes the form of simplicity sometimes, and sometimes that is the best form of profundity.
Sometimes profound wisdom is like spontaneous enlightenment. You have to already have it in order to get it.
Right. And think about the, quote, simplicity of Small Gods by Terry Pratchett. The word doesn't apply very well other than some of the language and dialogue and ways that the narrative flows is simple, but it's delivered in ways that has depth and layers.
I would, for this book and for Small Gods, I would exchange the word simple for accessible.
That's a good way to put it. Just because something's accessible doesn't mean that it's not profound, that there's not wisdom to be gleaned from it.
Okay, the last subset of bad reviews that I read, and this one was real fun for me, is this book sucks, but here's a book that's way better. And I'll again give you two comments that had 1 stars for this book. Quote, stupid book. Don't waste your time. If you want a great book or books on strategy, read either the 48 Laws of Power or the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. And the second one, quote, in the 11th century, Japanese lady-in-waiting Murasaki penned the first novel, The Tale of Genji, written with an eye for human foibles,
right,
court intrigues, and romance. The story holds up fairly well by modern standards. This story wasn't widely known because it was difficult to translate. Gentle reminder that just because a book is old doesn't mean it's good or that the ideas are somehow more valid than new ones. We need to stop giving men microphones. Delete that part out of that one. But P.S. It's a simpler, more shallow version of Sun Tzu's Art of War. End quote. So, and these are just 2 excerpts, but I read many that are like, you should read this book instead or this book instead. It's like,
I don't know where to begin on this one.
if you liked that book so much, then I'm sorry that you were too shallow to to appreciate a different perspective, another human viewpoint onto the idea of strategy.
Book of Five Rings is one way for me is of looking at it is it's a little time machine. And I love jumping in that time machine and trying to get a glimpse through the clouds of intervening centuries and culture of what it was like then and what was going on then. I've glanced through Sun Tzu's book and I want to dig more into it. Comparing the two and saying one is better than the other, that's hard. That is a unnecessary comparison, I think, and takes a lot away from both texts. And then this reviewer mentions the 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. I don't know where to begin on 48 Laws of Power, and maybe we can cut this part out, but this is a very bad book, in my opinion. And I've heard over and over again from multiple people, from multiple sources that, wow, the 48 Laws of Power is such a great book. And it is unreadable, in my opinion. It is unreadably bad. And I don't know that we need to give it any more airtime than that, but it is profoundly bad and shallow, in my opinion.
Well, this whole thing is just our opinion.
Yep.
So that concludes our bad critiques section. And I'll say, I thought it was a great book. And also, with how much time it takes to read it, I don't see how it could be a waste of time. You could read the whole book in an afternoon. But it has so many great nuggets of philosophy you could take into your own world, even without doing martial arts.
If you wanted to.
Yeah, if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But I guess if you're closed-minded and have the inability for change and development of skill, I guess you can.
Not even that. I mean, it just might not be inherently interesting to other people. We're just talking about a book that we read that was interesting and fascinating to us. This subject matters and historical context for this one just are not going to be that inherently fascinating to other people. We just wanted to invite other people to our discussion of it that we thought was fascinating. So you would recommend the book, but with the caveat of, hey, you have to be interested in this, and there's other stuff you need to do to engage with this book.
I mean, it's true for everything. You have to be interested in it in order to enjoy it, for the most part. If you don't care anything about ecology, then reading an ecology textbook is not going to be fun. You might get something out of it, but it's not going to be fun if you hate it. Or math, if you hate math, reading a math textbook is going to be miserable for you. Not to say that there isn't great truth or wisdom in there. And the last thing I'll say on this is I don't think we necessarily need to disparage books that say the same knowledge. In fact, it's better if we have books from different perspectives that shed light on the same truth, because people learn in different ways and people connect in different ways. So it's good to have different, almost like flashlights pointing at a truth so that you can find the one that resonates with you.
That's a great way to put it. That reminds me of our discussion of Atomic Habits. Did that book cover anything groundbreakingly new? Not really, but I appreciated the book for what it was. It was innovative, and I really appreciated the perspectives that were provided and the combinations of ways of looking at things and doing things that were provided. For me, it was worth the time. None of the critiques we've gone over come near the reality of my experience with this book. I would recommend it to anyone who likes classical literature and likes a little bit of a struggle with the book, but I wouldn't say it's a must read.
I agree. So now there's a couple of quotes I wanted to share from the book, and this is a complete hodgepodge of the translations, and I'm not going to credit whatever translator is the one that translated it. I just wanted to share these nuggets of wisdom.
All right. Tell us your quotes that you took away from here.
Okay. I didn't want to have like a huge laundry list for it. Okay. So I'll read some. Quote, "You must understand that there is more than one path to the top of the mountain." End quote.
I like that. That's a great one.
Quote, "Do nothing that is of no use." End quote.
We talked about the one. I like that thought too.
Quote, "The ultimate aim of martial arts is not having to use them." End quote.
That was in there? That was in one of the translations?
I think so. Here, let me fact check real quick with the internet. By Miyamoto Musashi. All right, I'm not going to sit here and read through the whole thing. It's from Musashi. It may not be from the book, but it's from Musashi. I think it's from the book. Okay. Quote, think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world.
Yeah, I like that. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world.
I think that's something we can all walk away with and really connect with having a better day.
I like that. I like that.
Quote, you can only fight the way you practice.
That reminds me of the technique I was mentioning earlier of treating a light or submaximal lift as an opportunity to practice it being the most difficult. That also reminds me of the idea of voluntarily doing something difficult or doing something in a very particular way so that when the situation's no longer voluntary, you don't have to think about it. You just, that is the way that you execute. That is the way you do something.
Quote, to know 10,000 things, know one well. And we see this through Musashi's writings the whole time, where you find the way narrowly to find it broadly. You master one thing before you branch out. Bruce Lee, same thing, we talked about him earlier. Master one thing, and through that, you can know many things.
Right. What else do you have here?
Quote, there is nothing outside of yourself that can ever enable you to get better, stronger, richer, quicker, or smarter. Everything is within. Quote, do not regret what you have done.
I don't know about that one, but okay.
Quote, the way is in training.
Okay.
And that's all the quotes I have for you.
I like this collection of quotes.
So take from that what you will. I think my final takeaways is through both this book and through my own personal experience with martial arts is that the way is through training, that you need to master one technique first, that whatever you do in your practice is what you'll do in real life. So whether you are doing weightlifting, if you're doing rescue, if you're doing whatever, when you go to practice that, treat it as though it's the real thing, because that's what you're going to revert back to. To take from James Clear, right? We're going to fall to the level of our systems, not rise to the level of ambition that we have.
Yeah, to reiterate, my main takeaway from reading this book and thinking about this book would probably be that intense focus that comes through clearly through the centuries in this text that Musashi brings to bear, that intense focus that he has on his art and pursuing mastery itself. For me, that is inspiring, for lack of a better word. I really appreciate that. I really like that. And that's probably the thing that will stay with me the strongest.
Great. You have any other thoughts?
I don't think so. This has been a really fun book to go through. We brought to bear so many different concepts and contextual information. It was fantastic.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Thanks so much. We would love to hear your thoughts, whether they're positive, negative, neutral, whatever it is. You like the book, hate the book. We would both love if you reach out to us. You can reach us on Instagram at Deep Dive Book Club, or
you can find us on X now. We are at Deep Dive BC on X, Instagram, Deep Dive Book Club, patreon.com/Deep Dive Book Club, or just the old-fashioned send me an email at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com.
Or write your comments on whatever platform. I think we had our first comment actually on our last episode, to which I replied to, and they got to share their opinion. So great. Thanks so much. And we'll be back next week with a new episode for you, and hopefully you enjoy this and continue on the journey with us.
See you guys next week.